The most important thing I ever built was a hole in the ground. I have told this to my grandson twice now, and both times he has looked at me the way young men look at old ones when they suspect the old one has begun to wander. He is 24 years old and studying law in Helena, and he has the reasonable expectation that a carpenter of 40 years' experience would name as his finest work something that can be seen from a road, a barn frame, a church steeple, a house that a family still lives in. A hole in the ground does not satisfy this expectation. I understand that. But I am 78 years old, and I have earned the right to answer questions in the order that honesty requires rather than the order that convenience prefers. The hole in the ground comes first, because without it, the story makes no sense. And the story is what my grandson asked for on this spring morning in 1923, sitting on the porch of the house I built with my own hands in 1894, watching the cottonwoods put out their new leaves along the creek bottom below. He asked me what the most important thing I ever built was. I told him to sit down and stop looking at his watch. The hole was 6 feet deep, 8 feet wide, and 12 feet long, dug into the clay subsoil of a north-running hillside above a creek called Holt Creek in the Montana Territory in the autumn of 1882. It was stone-lined and sod-roofed and entered through a short tunnel that faced south-southeast, away from the prevailing wind, through a pair of heavy insulated doors that created, between them, a pocket of dead air the cold could not easily cross. The temperature inside that hole in the middle of the winter of 1886 to 1887, which was the worst winter Montana had seen in the memory of anyone then living, was 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside on the hillside above it, the temperature was minus 43. I will let those two numbers sit for a moment because they deserve it. The woman who designed that hole, and who paid me $4 and a side of salt pork to help her build it, was named Sigrid Halverson. She was Norwegian. She was a widow. She had arrived in Holt Creek in the late summer of 1882 with 2 brown milk cows, 4 sheep, a wagon, and a set of knowledge about how to spend a Montana winter that nobody in the valley had asked her about and nobody in the valley wanted to hear. I am going to tell you about that knowledge. I am going to tell you where it came from and how it was built into the ground of that hillside, and what happened to this valley in the winter it proved itself. And I am going to tell you about the 5 years before that winter, during which the knowledge sat on a hillside above Holt Creek, visible to anyone who cared to walk up and look at it, while the people of this valley, myself included, and I will not excuse myself from this, looked at it and declined to see. That is the part of the story I have had the most difficulty telling. I will tell it anyway because my grandson has asked, and because there are fewer mornings left to me than there used to be, and this particular morning is too fine to spend on anything less than the truth. Holt Creek in the autumn of 1882 was a cattle town in the first easy phase of its confidence. The range grass was thick. The cattle were fat. The railroad had come through 3 years prior, and with it had come the particular kind of certainty that a rail connection produces in a frontier settlement. The certainty that the world beyond the horizon has been permanently attached to this one, that supplies will arrive on schedule, that what cannot be produced locally need not be, because the train will bring it. This certainty felt like prosperity. It felt like permanence. It was, as certainties of that kind usually are, a condition entirely dependent on everything continuing to go well. Everything had, so far, continued to go well. And so the certainty held. The commercial center of Holt Creek was Calvin Marsh's feed and hardware store, a long board and batten building on the east side of the main street that smelled of oats and axle grease and the particular institutional authority of a man who has positioned himself between a community and everything that community needs. Calvin stocked flour, sugar, coffee, salt pork, seed grain, hardware, rope, lamp oil, and a dozen other necessities. He extended credit to the ranching families in the autumn and collected in the spring when the cattle money came in. He set his prices according to his own assessment of what the market would bear, which is to say, according to his own assessment of what people could not do without. which is to say at a level that kept everyone in the valley in a state of mild and permanent financial relationship with Calvin Marsh. He was not a cruel man. I want to be precise about this because precision matters, and because Calvin is dead now and cannot defend himself. He was a man who had found a position that suited him and who maintained it with the automatic vigilance of someone who has never had occasion to examine whether the position was deserved. He did not think of himself as a monopolist. He thought of himself as a provider, which in his case amounted to the same thing, and the distinction did not trouble him. The ranches that surrounded the valley ran cattle on the open range in the manner that had worked well enough for 15 years. The largest of them belonged to Theodore Pratt, who ran approximately 4,000 head on leased land east of the creek, and who was, in the autumn of 1882, a satisfied man. His cattle were healthy. His credit with Calvin was good. His wife, Eleanor, organized the social calendar of Holt Creek's respectable families with the energetic precision of a woman who has brought standards to a place that was inclined to do without them and has decided this inclination will not prevail. Into this settled and self-regarding community, in September of 1882, came Sigrid Halverson. She came alone, which was the first thing people noticed. She had a wagon, 2 cows on a lead line behind it, and 4 sheep in a slatted crate lashed to the wagon's bed. The cows were the brown, dual-purpose breed the Norwegians preferred, thick through the body, placid in the way of animals that have been handled well for generations. The sheep were some small hardy variety I did not recognize then and cannot name now. She drove the wagon herself, which was not remarkable for a woman traveling alone, but the way she drove it was, with the unhurried attentiveness of someone who is watching the land on either side of the road more carefully than they are watching the road itself. I was standing outside Calvin's store when she came in off the Miles City Road. I was 22 years old, newly arrived myself, 3 days into a barn framing commission that was going to last me through November. I watched her stop the wagon in front of the store and climb down, and I watched her stand for a moment in the street looking south down the valley and then north toward the hills, with the particular stillness of someone who is making a decision that has not yet announced itself as a decision. She came into the store. She bought lamp oil, a quantity of tallow, and 3 pounds of dried beans. She asked Calvin if he stocked flat limestone. Calvin told her he kept some out back, but that it was spoken for. This was a partial truth, which in Calvin's practice was the working unit of commerce. He did have limestone behind the store, a pile of flat gray slabs he had accepted 2 years prior in partial settlement of a debt and had not yet found a use for. It was not spoken for. But the woman asking for it was a stranger, a widow traveling alone, with no credit established and no ranching operation that Calvin could attach to her account, and Calvin's instinct in such circumstances was to decline without declining, to cite an obstacle that discouraged further inquiry without constituting an outright refusal. She thanked him and left. I watched her through the store window as she walked back to her wagon. She did not go directly to it. She walked instead to the edge of the creek drainage, where the land began to rise toward the northern hills, and she stood there for a time that I would estimate, in retrospect, at close to 10 minutes. She was not looking at the creek. She was looking at the hillside above it, at the angle of the slope, at the grass, at the places where the soil changed color, at the outcroppings of stone near the surface. She was reading the ground. That was the only way I could have described it then, and it is the only way I can describe it now. She was reading the ground the way a man reads a contract, carefully, with full attention, looking for the specific language that tells you what the thing can and cannot do. Then she went back to her wagon and drove north. She had filed on a homestead claim the following morning at the land office 2 towns east. A quarter section on the north drainage of Holt Creek, steep and rocky, the kind of land the agent was accustomed to describing with the careful honesty of a man whose job occasionally requires him to look a hopeful settler in the eye. He told her the hillside was unsuitable for grain farming. He told her the creek bottom flooded in spring. He told her the soil was thin and the slope was too pronounced for any conventional agricultural purpose. She told him she understood all of that. He sold her the quarter section for $12. What he did not know, and what I did not know for another 6 weeks, was that she had not been looking at the hillside from the road. She had walked up it twice before she went to the land office. She had brought a short iron rod and pushed it into the soil at 5 different points along the slope, measuring the depth of the surface loam before it met the hard clay substratum beneath. She had dug down with her hands at 2 of those points, pulling out small fistfuls of subsoil and examining them, feeling the density, smelling the clay content, testing how the material held its shape when compressed in her palm. She had found what she was looking for: a seam of dense, low-permeability clay sitting above a shelf of flat sandstone, precisely the subsurface geology that her father had taught her to identify as the ideal foundation for the kind of structure she intended to build. She had paid $12 for what she had already established, by her own assessment, was exactly the right piece of ground. When she told me this, weeks later, on a cold morning when I had come to help her build, I asked her how she had learned to read land that way. She thought about the question for a moment, in the way she thought about most questions, completely and without hurry. My father, she said, in Telemark, in Norway, where I grew up, he built farmsteads in the old way, stone and timber and turf. He taught me that the land tells you what it can hold if you ask it the right way. Most people ask from the surface. He taught me to ask from below. She handed me a level and went back to work. I thought about what she had said for the rest of the morning, and I said nothing about it to anyone in town, and that silence is one of the things I have carried longest. The people of Holt Creek formed their opinion of Sigrid Halvorsen in the way that small communities form opinions of newcomers, quickly, on limited information, and with a confidence that the subsequent correction of that information does not fully dislodge. She was Norwegian, which was not unusual on the northern frontier, but marked her as foreign in a way that her careful English could not entirely erase. She was a widow without family, which placed her outside the social categories that the Valley's women used to organize their understanding of who belonged and on what terms. And she was, from her first week in the Valley, doing something that nobody could quite name as wrong, but that everybody agreed was at the very least unnecessary. She was building a structure unlike any structure in the Valley. Not a cabin, not a barn, not a smokehouse, but a long, low mound of excavated earth on a steep hillside, accessible through a south-facing tunnel, topped with a roof of pine timber and packed clay and thick-cut sod. It did not look like a building. It looked like the ground itself had been rearranged. Calvin Marsh, when Walt Brecker made the mistake of describing it with enthusiasm, examined the idea for approximately 4 seconds. A grave, he said. The woman has dug herself a Norwegian grave, and she plans to put her root vegetables in it. I suppose they do things differently in Norway. He was not being cruel. He was filing. The unfamiliar thing had been placed in a category: foreign, unnecessary, faintly comic, and the category resolved the need for further consideration. The Valley, for the most part, accepted this resolution. It was convenient, and the winter of 1882 was mild, and the supply train arrived on schedule, and there was no particular urgency about reconsidering anything at all. The Norwegian grave, that was what they called it quietly, in parlors and at the store, in the way that small communities name the things they have decided not to understand. Sigrid heard it eventually, through one of the Hill families who traded with her and who repeated it without malice, the way people repeat what they have heard when they assume the subject would want to know. She was carrying a flat stone when the woman told her. She set the stone in place, checked its level, and went back up the hill for another one. She had a great deal left to build, and the first frost was 3 weeks away, and there was no time to spend on the opinions of people who had not yet asked the right question. Before I tell you how the earth cellar was built, I need to tell you where the idea came from. Not because the origin is more interesting than the construction, The construction is, to my mind, the most interesting part of anything, but because the origin is the thing that the people of Holt Creek never understood, and their failure to understand it is part of the story in a way that cannot be skipped. They thought Sigrid Halvorsen had invented something. This was the source of their contempt in the early years, and the source of their astonishment later when the invention proved itself. In both cases, they were wrong. She had not invented anything. She had remembered something. And the difference between those two things, between invention and memory, is the difference between a curiosity and a tradition, between a clever idea and a proven one, between a thing that might work and a thing that has been working, quietly and without acknowledgement for longer than anyone in Holt Creek had been alive. The knowledge came from her father. His name was Gunnar Halvorsen, and he was a builder in the inland hill country of Telemark, in the mountainous center of Norway, where the winters arrive in October and do not leave until May, and the cold between those months is of the kind that has no interest in apology or accommodation. He had learned the trade from his own father, who had learned it from his in the unbroken manner of knowledge transmission that requires no institution and no documentation because it passes directly from the hands of one generation to the hands of the next, demonstrated rather than described, absorbed through proximity rather than instruction. What Gunnar built were Jordskjelvere, earth cellars, in the direct translation, though the English word does not carry the full weight of the Norwegian one, which implies not just a hole in the ground but a specific relationship between the structure and the land, a conversation between the builder and the soil in which the soil does the larger part of the work. He had built a dozen of them in Telemark for his own family and for the families of neighbors, and Sigrid had watched him build the first one she could clearly remember when she was 7 years old. She described it to me on the second day we worked together, in the particular way she described things she had learned young, not as instruction, but as recollection, as though she were walking back through a place she knew well and pointing out what was there. He dug in October, she told me, before the ground froze. He said the ground tells you when to start, when the mornings smell like iron and the grass stops growing but has not yet gone brown. That is the week. After that, the ground gets hard, and the work gets twice as difficult for half the result. She had stood beside her father and handed him tools and watched the hole take shape over 2 weeks, going from a mark scratched in the turf to a clean-walled excavation 6 feet deep, the walls showing distinct layers of soil, dark loam at the top, then a paler sandy layer, then the dense gray-blue clay that her father treated with the respect a stonemason gives good limestone. He ran his hand along the clay wall each morning before he began work, feeling for moisture, feeling for variation. He was reading it, even then. Even standing in the hole he had dug, he was still reading the ground. He told me, Sigrid said, that the earth at that depth does not know what month it is. It knows what year it is, in the way that very slow things know time, in seasons, not in days. The cold above works down through the soil, but it works slowly, and if you have enough earth between you and the cold arrives in March, and by then the winter is done anyway. What the earth holds at 6 feet is the memory of the last summer. You are borrowing warmth from a summer that is already past. I did not write this down at the time. I wish I had. I have been reconstructing it from memory for 40 years, and I believe I have it right. But the phrasing was hers, and I cannot be certain I have kept it exactly. What I am certain of is the principle, because the principle was subsequently demonstrated to me in terms that no amount of imprecise memory can distort. 36 degrees Fahrenheit inside the cellar, minus 43 outside, on the coldest night of the worst winter in Montana's history. The principle proved itself. The phrasing can afford to be approximate. Sigrid had been building the earth cellar for 3 weeks before she hired me. I want to be clear about this because there is a version of the story which I have heard repeated in later years in which the carpenter comes and does the work, and the woman supervises. That is not what happened. When I arrived at her claim on the first Monday of November 1882, She had already excavated the site to 4 feet, dry stacked the first 2 courses of stone on the north and east walls, and graded the sandstone floor with a thin bed of creek sand she had carried up the hill in a wooden bucket, 1 load at a time, on her own back. She had hired me for the roof work. She could dig and she could lay stone. She had learned both from her father, but she needed a second pair of hands for the timber framing, and she needed someone who could read a level, which was a tool she had not yet acquired. She paid me $4 for 12 days of work and fed me a hot meal at noon each day, which was, in the cold of that November, worth at least as much as the wages. The flour sack was on the table when I arrived, a clean one, folded in quarters, with the plans drawn on it in pencil. I looked at them for a few minutes before I said anything, because what I was looking at was better than I had expected, and I wanted to be certain of that before I said it. The drawing showed the cellar in cross-section, the excavation, the stone lining, the floor, the roof structure, and above the roof, in careful layers with measurements noted beside each one, the materials that would go between the timber and the open air. It also showed the entry tunnel in plan view, with its orientation marked by a small compass rose she had drawn in the corner. South-southeast, toward the winter sun and away from the north wind. There were notes in the margins, some in English and some in Norwegian, and the Norwegian ones she translated for me when I asked, though she seemed mildly surprised that I needed the translation, as if the drawings themselves ought to have been explanation enough. They nearly were. The walls, she said, tracing the cross-section with 1 finger, are dry-stacked, not mortared. In Norway, we learned that mortar cracks when the ground shifts in freeze and thaw, and each crack is a place where cold air enters and moisture follows. Dry stone, laid tight, moves with the ground. It breathes in the way that a wall should breathe, slowly and together, not in pieces. I had built mortared stone foundations. I knew she was right about the cracking because I had repaired enough of them to understand the pattern, but I had not thought to draw the obvious conclusion. It is easy, in carpentry, to inherit the methods of the men who trained you and to apply them without examination. Sigrid had not inherited a carpenter's methods. She had inherited a builder's principles, which is a different thing, and the difference showed in every decision she had made before I arrived. The birch bark, she continued, moving her finger to the roof layers, goes between the timber and the clay. In Norway, we call it never rot. It keeps moisture from coming down through the clay and into the storage chamber, and it keeps the smell of birch in the air inside, which the mice do not like. They will not nest where they smell birchwood tar. This is something my father's father discovered, not in one cellar, but in many, over many years. By the time my father built, it was simply what you did, the way you add salt to bread. You do it because it works, and because everyone who tried not doing it wished they had. The ventilation she showed me last, because it was the most counterintuitive element of the design, and she wanted me to understand the principle before I saw the execution. 2 small timber tubes, she explained, angled sharply downward from the outside air into the upper portion of the storage chamber, not horizontal, not upward, but distinctly, deliberately downward. I asked her why. Cold air is heavy, she said, heavier than warm air. If the tube runs level or upward, the cold air outside sits at the tube's mouth and does not enter, and the warm, moist air inside builds up and condenses, and you get wet walls and rotting vegetables. If the tube angles down, the cold air outside is always slightly lower than the warm air inside at the tube's inner end, and a very slow exchange happens, just enough to keep the air fresh, not enough to let the cold in. My father said it was like leaving a window open the width of a finger, enough to breathe, not enough to freeze. I had never heard airflow described that way. I have spent 40 years since that morning thinking about it whenever I am designing a structure that needs to breathe, and I have not found a better description. We began on the roof timbers that first morning, working from her measurements, which were precise to a degree that I, at 22, found mildly startling. She used a Norwegian measuring rod she had brought from home. a long, straight-grained birch stick, notched at intervals in a unit I had not encountered, and she translated each measurement for me into feet and inches with the patience of a woman who understood that the system was mine, not hers, and that the inconvenience of translation was simply part of the work. The timbers were 6-inch pine, cut from the creek bottom and seasoned through the summer under a weighted tarpaulin. They were not perfect timber. Creek bottom pine rarely is, but she had selected them with care, rejecting the pieces with excessive knots or spiral grain, and what remained was serviceable, straight enough to span without sag, dense enough to carry the load of clay and sod that would go above them. We laid them close together, leaving gaps of no more than 2 inches between adjacent timbers, and she checked each gap with a stick she had notched to that exact width before we moved to the next. The consistency mattered, she explained, because the birch bark needed to lie flat across the entire surface without bridging gaps that would allow it to sag under the weight of the clay above. A bridge of bark over a 2-inch gap would hold for a season. A bridge over a 4-inch gap would fail, and the failure would be invisible until the day the clay above it settled through, and the careful geometry of the insulating layers collapsed into the storage chamber below. I thought about this as we worked. I thought about the number of roofs I had built in the preceding 3 years. Board roofs, shake roofs, one sod roof on a homestead north of Miles City that had been specified by the owner and that I had built without fully understanding, and I could not, with honesty, say that I had checked the consistency of my gaps. I had built to my training, which was competent and practical, and my training had not included the level of attention that Sigrid Halvorsen was paying to a structure that the people of Holt Creek had already dismissed as a Norwegian grave. It was an education, that 12 days. I did not fully understand it as an education at the time. I understood it as an interesting commission from an unusual client, and I rode back to Holt Creek in the evenings thinking mainly about the technical problems we had solved during the day rather than about what those problems and their solutions indicated about the woman who had identified them. That came later. Most of the understanding came later, as it generally does, after the fact, in the long light of consequence, when it is too late to be useful and just early enough to be honest. The birch bark went on a Thursday, the clay on Friday and Saturdays, the sod the following Monday, when the first hard frost had stiffened the hillside enough to carry our weight without leaving deep prints in the turf. Sigrid had cut the sod blocks in September and stacked them to cure in a low pile behind the entry tunnel, grass side down, so the roots would knit together in the weeks before laying. Each block was cut to a consistent size. She had made a wooden frame as a guide, and each one was laid with the roots facing upward, so that by spring they would reach back into the hillside's native grass, and the cellar roof would become, to any eye not already informed of its existence, simply a rounded swelling in the hill. She packed the clay above the timbers in 4 layers, tamping each one with the flat back of a spade before applying the next, and she checked the depth of each compacted layer with a marked rod, the same birch rod she used for everything, its notches now familiar enough to me that I no longer needed the translation. The layers were not equal. The first was thinnest, 4 inches, packed very firmly, to seal the surface of the birch bark and prevent any movement between the bark and the clay above. The second and third were 6 inches each, packed to a medium firmness. The fourth was the thickest, 7 inches, packed firmly again, and it was this top layer that would bond with the roots of the sod above and become, over time, as much a part of the hill as the hill itself, 18 inches of clay in total. Above that, 4 inches of sod, 22 inches of earth and root, and the patient slow chemistry of compacted subsoil between the storage chamber and the Montana winter. I stood on the finished roof and jumped on it once to test it. This was a habit from framing work. You learn quickly that the only honest test of a structure is your own weight placed on it without warning. The roof did not shift. It did not flex. It did not produce any sound at all. It felt underfoot like standing on the hillside itself, because that was, functionally, what I was doing. Sigrid watched me from below. "My father did the same thing," she said. "He said a roof that moves under a man is a roof that is thinking about failing. A roof that does not move has already decided what it is." I climbed down. We hung the inner door and tested the outer one, and she was satisfied with both, and I packed my tools into their box and collected my $4 and rode back down the hill toward Holt Creek in the last light of a November afternoon, cold enough to see my breath, watching the valley below fill up with the blue shadow of the coming dark. Behind me, built into the hillside, invisible from the road, the earth cellar settled into the ground that it had been made from. The clay began its slow bond with the sod above. The stone walls, dry stacked and tight, made no sound as the temperature dropped and the ground contracted slightly around them. The cellar had 4 years to wait before it would be needed. It did not mind. It had no opinion about time. It simply held what it was built to hold, in the dark and the quiet and the constant cold-resisting warmth of the earth itself, patient as the stone that lined its walls, waiting for the winter that would make its waiting make sense. The winter of 1882 was ordinary. I want to place that word carefully because it will carry weight later, and because the word itself, ordinary, is one of the most dangerous words available to a community that has decided to use its recent experience as a reliable guide to the future. The winter of 1882 was ordinary in the way that the 3 winters following it were ordinary, cold, long, occasionally difficult, but manageable within the assumptions that the people of Holt Creek had built their lives around. The supply trains ran. Calvin Marsh's shelves stayed stocked. Theodore Pratt's cattle lost some weight through January and February and recovered it by April when the grass came back. The wooden root cellars around the valley froze out their contents in the worst cold snaps and held them tolerably in the milder stretches, which was the condition everyone had accepted as simply how root cellars behaved, the way you accept that a leaky roof is a roof and not the absence of a roof. Sigrid Halvorsson's earth cellar in that first winter performed precisely as she had said it would. Her carrots came through March firm and orange and faintly sweet with the cold-converted starch that root vegetables develop when they are held just above freezing for a long time. Her turnips were dense and unmarked. Her potatoes, packed in dry sand in their barrel, were as sound in April as they had been in October. Nobody in Holt Creek asked her how she had managed this. The result was visible. She brought a small quantity of produce to trade at Calvin's store in late February, and the produce was demonstrably better than anything that had come out of the valley's wooden cellars, but visible results in a community that has already filed a thing under a particular heading do not automatically revise the filing. They are noted, attributed to luck or circumstance or some private foreign eccentricity, and the filing stands. Lucky, they said. The Norwegian grave had a lucky first winter. Sigrid heard this through the Hill families who kept her company through those years, the Renners, who ran goats on the high meadow north of her claim, and the Andersons, a Danish couple who had filed on a quarter section east of hers and who visited on Sundays when the weather allowed. These were the people who talked to her, who ate at her table, who understood that the woman on the hill was not peculiar but precise, and that precision in their experience of hard country was not an eccentricity but a survival skill. They were not prominent people in the valley's social order, which is to say that their assessment of Sigrid Halvorsson did not circulate far. The people whose assessments circulated, Calvin, the Pratts, the men who gathered at the assay office to discuss matters of local importance, had made their assessment in the first month and saw no reason to revisit it. So the first winter passed, and the filing held, and in the spring of 1883 Sigrid began the next phase of her building. The turf barn was the second structure, and it was the second structure that gave Calvin Marsh the material for his finest piece of mockery, which was also, as it turned out, the piece he would most regret. She built it against the north wall of her existing board shelter, a three-sided affair that had come with the claim, serviceable in summer, useless in serious cold. She did not tear it down. Instead, she built against it, stacking sod blocks against the board walls on three sides to a height of 5 feet, then continuing those walls inward to fully enclose the space, adding a low sod roof on pine beams that she cut and fitted herself, having absorbed enough carpentry from our 12 days of work together to manage straightforward framing without assistance. The sod walls, once they knitted over the summer, were 22 inches thick. I have already told you what 22 inches of compacted sod does to the thermal exchange between inside and outside. The animal heat from her 2 cows and 4 sheep, which I can now tell you because I looked it up in an agricultural manual after the fact, amounts to approximately 3,400 British thermal units per hour from that particular combination of animals, was contained by those walls with an efficiency that no board structure of any reasonable thickness could have matched. She had, in effect, built a living insulation system around a passive heating system, using materials that cost her nothing but time and labor, and the result was a barn that would, in the winter of 1887, never drop below 19 degrees Fahrenheit on its coldest night. But that was 4 years away. In the summer of 1883, what she had was a structure that looked, from the road below, like a large, irregular mound of earth with a door set into one side. Eleanor Pratt drove past it on her way to a church auxiliary meeting in late July, slowed her buggy, looked at it for a moment, and made a remark to her companion, Vera Hollister, that Sigrid Halverson had apparently confused Montana with a badger colony. Vera Hollister repeated this to her husband. Her husband told it at the assay office. Within a week, it had traveled through the Valley's social network with the efficiency that small communities reserve for information that confirms what they have already decided to think. Sigrid heard it from Mrs. Anderson, who told it apologetically, with the expression of a woman who is delivering bad news she has been asked to deliver. Sigrid was laying the last course of sod on the barn roof when Mrs. Anderson told her. She set the block in place, checked its fit with both hands, and went back down the ladder for the next one. "Thank you for telling me," she said. That was all. Mrs. Anderson, who had expected more of a response, waited for a moment and then helped carry sod. The construction challenges of those first years were not dramatic, and I want to be careful not to make them so, because the truth of how Sigrid built was not dramatic. It was patient and cumulative and occasionally frustrating in the small grinding ways that all solo building work is frustrating when the weather does not cooperate and the materials are imperfect and there is no one to hold the other end of a timber while you position it. The first frost of 1883 came 3 weeks early, stiffening the ground before she had finished cutting the sod for the barn roof, and forcing her to work with blocks that were harder than she wanted and fractionally less likely to knit properly in the spring. She adapted. She cut the blocks thicker, knowing that thicker blocks retained more moisture through the winter freeze and came out of it with better root viability. But the adaptation cost her 2 extra days and a quantity of effort that left her hands cracked and bleeding at the fingertips for a week. She worked through it. She bandaged her hands in the evenings with strips of clean cloth soaked in rendered tallow, and unwrapped them in the mornings and went back to the hillside. In the spring of 1884, a portion of the earth cellar's sod cap lifted at the northeast corner, not a structural failure, but a consequence of an unusually wet spring thaw that had allowed a small amount of water to pool beneath the turf and freeze again in a late cold snap, heaving the sod block out of true. She repacked the clay beneath it, relaid the block, and cut additional sod from the surrounding hillside to feather the repair into the existing surface. She kept a note about it in her building ledger, a small cloth-covered book she kept on the shelf beside the inner cellar door, with a notation about the drainage pattern that had allowed the pooling and a sketch of a small diversion channel she cut the following summer to redirect the water away from that corner. The problem did not recur. In the autumn of 1884, she discovered that One of her ventilation tubes had developed a slow blockage. Compacted clay had crept forward from the wall into the tube's inner end, reducing the air exchange enough that she began to notice an increase in condensation on the cellar walls. She cleared the blockage with a long-handled brush she made from a bundle of dried grass lashed to a birch dowel, then fitted a thin stone cap over the tube's inner end. A flat piece of sandstone set slightly proud of the opening on 3 small wedges, leaving a gap that allowed air to pass but prevented the clay wall from migrating inward again. She noted the solution in her ledger. She noted everything in that ledger, every modification, every problem, every result. The temperature inside the cellar on the coldest morning of each winter, measured with the small thermometer she had brought from Minnesota. The condition of each stored crop in February and again in April. The date of the first frost and the date of the last each year, and the direction of the wind on the mornings that she considered significant. I have held that ledger in my hands. The Omdahl family, who maintained the cellar after Sigrid's death, kept it on the same shelf where she had kept it, and they showed it to me on my last visit. The handwriting is small and regular, shifting slightly between English and Norwegian as the subject changes. English for measurements, Norwegian for observations about the land, as if her 2 languages carried different types of attention. The final entry is dated October of 1900, the autumn before she died. It reads, in English, "Frost arrived September 29th, earlier than usual. Ventilation tubes clear, clay cap holding, cellar ready. She was 64 years old. She was still reading the ground. Now I need to tell you about the signs, because the signs are part of the story, and because ignoring them, the specific, deliberate, entirely human ignoring of information that does not fit the prevailing certainty, is the thing I most want my grandson to understand." The summer of 1886 was wet, unusually wet. The range grass grew taller than anyone in the valley could remember, which the ranchers took as generosity, the land giving more than usual, fattening their cattle ahead of a normal winter. Theodore Pratt rode his range in August and came back talking about the condition of his herd with the satisfaction of a man who has made correct decisions and is seeing them rewarded. Calvin Marsh ordered his usual winter supply of hay and supplemental grain, the quantity adequate for the winters he had been having, which were ordinary winters, because the winters were always ordinary. In late September, a Crow man named Many Stones passed through the valley on his way east along a route his family had traveled for generations. He was not a young man. He had spent more autumns in that country than any rancher in the Holt Creek Valley had been alive, and he had learned to read an autumn the way Sigrid had learned to read the ground, from below the surface through signs that were available to anyone but legible only to those who had been taught the language. He stopped at Calvin's store for coffee and tobacco. Calvin filled his order. Many Stones stood at the door for a moment, looking north at the sky, with an expression that Calvin described to me later as concerned, though he admitted he had not thought to ask about it at the time. Before he left, Many Stones said 3 things. The muskrats on the creek had built their lodges twice the usual height. The Canada geese had flown south 3 weeks earlier than their customary date. The ants throughout the valley had moved their hills to the south side of every rock and every rise they could find, as if the entire insect population of the region had simultaneously decided that the north-facing side of anything was no longer a reasonable place to be. "I have seen one of these signs alone before," Many Stones said. "I have seen 2 together twice in my life. I have never seen all 3. What is coming will be unlike what you have known here." Calvin thanked him, poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, and moved on to the next customer. The information was available. It was stated plainly by a man who had earned the right to state it in a place where it could be heard by the person whose decisions most affected the valley's capacity to survive. It simply did not fit the filing system. A Crowman's reading of muskrat lodges and ant hills did not belong in the same category as the ranching decisions of a man who ran 4,000 head of cattle and had been doing so successfully for a decade. The categories were too different, and the certainty too comfortable, and the autumn afternoon too fine to spend reconsidering anything. So Calvin filed it and moved on, and many stones went east along his family's road. And the signs he had named remained in the valley, available to anyone who looked for them, unread. Sigrid had been reading them for weeks. She had noticed the muskrat lodges in August, not because she was looking for signs of a hard winter, but because she walked the creek bottom regularly to harvest birch bark, and checked the water's edge for what she thought of as the creek's news: the water level, the quality of the banks, the behavior of the animals that lived along it. The muskrat lodges were simply there, twice their ordinary height, and she noted them in the way she noted everything, by writing them down. She saw the geese go south on the 8th of September. She noted the date, compared it to the dates in her ledger from previous years, the 15th, the 19th, the 11th, and wrote 3 weeks early, unusual. The ants she had watched for several days in early October, moving her observation from one rock outcropping to the next along the hillside, confirming what she thought she was seeing before she committed it to the ledger. When she was certain, she wrote, "Ant hills relocated south, all of them on this hillside. Have not seen this before." And then she wrote beneath that entry in Norwegian, in the language she used, I believe, when she was thinking something she was not certain she was ready to say in English, a sentence I cannot reproduce exactly because my Norwegian was never adequate to her written hand, but which the Amdahl wife translated for me years later as something close to this: "The land is telling us something specific. I will act on it." What she did next was not dramatic either. It was simply preparation, carried out with the same methodical unhurry that characterized everything she did. She doubled her hay supply, buying from the Renners and the Andersons, and a family named Stitchfield who lived 3 miles north and who were glad to sell at a fair price and think nothing more of it. She filled the earth cellar to its absolute capacity, every shelf loaded, every corner used. The floor space between the shelves stacked with flat-sided containers she had made from scrap pine boards over the preceding 2 summers, each one sealed and labeled in her careful hand. She added 6 more inches of sod to the barn roof, working through 2 weeks of cold October rain that made the labor miserable and the result necessary. And she packed additional straw deep into the corners of the barn interior against the base of the sod walls. She cut and split enough firewood to last a family of 4 through 6 months. She was one person. She did not consider this excessive. None of this was visible from the road. None of it was the kind of thing that reaches the assay office or Calvin's store or the Pratt dining table, where the serious decisions of the valley were made and discussed. It was the private work of a woman on a hillside, preparing for something she could not name with certainty, but could feel in the weight of the autumn air, and the height of the muskrat lodges, and the direction every ant in her hillside had chosen to face. The supply train arrived on November 15th, and was, in the memory of the station master who recorded it, the last train to reach Holt Creek that winter. Nobody knew this at the time. The railroad schedule posted at the depot showed trains arriving every 2 weeks through March, as they always had. The men who printed that schedule worked in an office in Billings and had not spent a winter in the mountains, and the winter that was coming had no interest in their schedule or their office or their reasonable expectations. On the 22nd of November, the temperature dropped 12 degrees in 4 hours. By morning it was 15 below zero and still falling, and the sky to the north had the particular flat white quality that old hands in the territory associated with weather of unusual seriousness, not the dramatic cloud-built approach of an ordinary blizzard, but a stillness that was itself a warning, the land holding its breath before something that did not need announcement. Sigrid stood at her cabin door that morning and looked at the sky for a long time. Then she went inside and put another log on the fire and checked the inner door of the earth cellar one more time, running her hand along the frame to confirm the seal, and went back to her morning work. She was ready. The valley was not. And the winter that had been building itself all autumn, in the height of muskrat lodges and the early departure of geese and the patient southward migration of every ant colony on every hillside from here to the Yellowstone, was about to make the difference between those two conditions as clear as it would ever be made, in terms that no one who survived them would spend the rest of their life forgetting. The blizzard came on the 9th of January, 1887, and it came the way the worst things come, without the courtesies of gradual approach, without the preliminary wind and darkening sky that give a person time to finish what they are doing and get inside. It arrived as a wall. 1 hour the valley was cold and still under a pale winter sky, and the next hour the north end of the valley was gone, swallowed by a moving white that came down from the mountains at a visible speed and took the middle distance, and then the near distance, and then the fence line 20 yards from Calvin's store window, and then there was nothing left to see, and the temperature, which had been 12 below zero at noon, dropped to 25 below by dark and kept going. By the morning of the 10th it was 40 below zero. It stayed there, not for a day, not for the 3 or 4 days that a hard Montana cold snap generally lasted before the pressure system shifted and the mercury climbed back to something a person could reason with. It stayed at 40 below, or near enough to make no practical difference, for 22 consecutive days. The thermometer at Calvin's store, the only reliable instrument in Holt Creek, descended below its marked scale on the 4th day and stayed there, which meant the temperature had passed minus 50 Fahrenheit and the thermometer had reached the limit of what it had been built to measure. Calvin tapped the glass each morning out of habit. The mercury did not move. He stopped tapping it after a week. I will not describe those 22 days as a sequence of events because that is not how they were experienced. They were experienced as a single sustained condition, a state of being rather than a progression of occurrences, the way a man who has been ill for 3 weeks does not remember individual days, but only the long, undifferentiated fact of the illness. What I can tell you is what the cold did to the things that were not built for it, because that is the story, and the story requires it. The cattle died. I have told you this already, but I have not told you the number, and the number matters. Theodore Pratt rode out on a day when the temperature had briefly, mercenarily lifted to 15 below, cold enough still to freeze exposed skin in minutes but survivable on a good horse with enough clothing, and he rode through 4 miles of his eastern range and counted. He came back and sat in his house and did not speak for the rest of that day, and when he spoke the following morning it was to his foreman, and the words were practical ones about what could still be salvaged and what could not. He did not say the number aloud to anyone for 3 weeks. When he finally told his wife Eleanor, she repeated it to no one. 3,100 head. Across the territory, across Montana and Wyoming and the western Dakotas, the cattlemen's associations would count, in the slow, painful arithmetic of the spring thaw, something close to 1 million animals lost. The open-range cattle era had been building toward its own end for years, through overgrazing and drought and the steady encroachment of fence lines across the free grass, and the winter of 1887 did not cause that end so much as arrive at it, the way a river arrives at the sea, inevitably, and with considerable force. The ranchers who survived the big die-up, as it came to be called, survived it differently than they had entered it. They fenced, they put up hay. They built proper shelter and kept smaller herds and stopped trusting the open sky to provide what the land itself was no longer capable of giving freely. But that reckoning came in spring. In January it was still only cold, and the cold was still the only fact that mattered. The board barns failed by the arithmetic I described in the previous chapter: 1-inch pine, 50 below zero, wind finding every gap with the thoroughness of a process that has all winter and no other purpose. The livestock shelters that the valley's families had considered adequate for ordinary winters reached temperatures of 0 and below on the worst nights, and the animals in them suffered accordingly. The wooden root cellars gave up their contents to the frost by the 3rd week of January. Potatoes turned black. Carrots became indistinguishable from the frozen soil around them. Turnips collapsed into themselves. the cells ruptured by ice crystals growing in the spaces between them. And what came out of those cellars in February was not food, but the memory of food, soft and darkened, and smelling of the particular defeat of a thing that has lost the structure that made it what it was. The supply train did not come. The passes were choked. The locomotives sat on their sidings and waited for a break in the weather that did not arrive, and the families of Holt Creek ate through what they had in their houses, and then through what they had in their cellars, and then through what they could borrow from each other, and the borrowing depleted quickly because everyone was depleting at the same rate, and there was nothing coming to replenish what was spent. On the 6th day of the blizzard, Ruth Hendricks walked half a mile through 47 below zero, with her 3 children roped together on a length of hemp line, herself at the front, navigating by the memory of the land, because the blizzard had taken every visible landmark and left only white. She was 34 years old. Her husband had died 2 years prior of a blood infection from a fencing wound that should not have been mortal and was, and she had been running her homestead alone since then, with the focused competence of a woman who has no margin for anything other than competence. She was not a woman who asked for help easily. The fact that she was walking through a blizzard at 47 below with her children roped to her back told you everything you needed to know about the condition of her house and her larder and her remaining options. Sigrid opened the door before Ruth had finished knocking. She looked at the 4 of them for the space of 2 breaths, Ruth's frost-white eyelashes, the children's faces pale and tight with cold, the rope still tied around the youngest child's waist, and she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "There is room." There was room. The cabin was small, 1 main room and a sleeping loft. But it was warm in a way that Ruth told me later, when I asked her about it years afterward, felt almost incomprehensible after 3 weeks in a house where the temperature had been dropping each night toward freezing, and the fire was eating through wood at a rate she could no longer sustain. The fieldstone hearth Sigrid had built was deep and wide, designed to hold heat in its mass long after the fire itself had died to coals, and the north wall of the cabin was banked with the same sod construction as the barn, 2 feet of compacted earth that absorbed the cold trying to enter from outside, and released the warmth trying to leave from inside. In the slow, patient exchange of a material that takes hours to change temperature rather than minutes. The children stopped shivering within 20 minutes. Ruth and her children stayed 11 days. I know this because Sigrid noted it in her ledger, the date of arrival, the date of departure, the quantities of food consumed, the state of the firewood supply, the temperature inside the cabin on each morning. She kept her records even then, even with 4 extra people in her 1-room house, because her records were not a luxury she kept in easy times and abandoned in difficult ones. They were simply how she operated. On the 8th day, when the temperature had risen to 22 below and the wind had laid enough to make movement between structures possible, Sigrid took Ruth to the earth cellar. She lit her lantern at the outer door of the entry tunnel, unlatched the first heavy door, led Ruth through the dead-air space of the tunnel, and unlatched the inner door. Ruth told me later that the smell reached her before the light did. Not a bad smell. The opposite of a bad smell, though she struggled to describe it in terms that captured what it meant to her at that moment. Earth, she said. Root vegetables, cedar planking, the faint sweetness of stored apples from the small wild trees on the creek bottom. It was the smell of October, she said. Of a day in October when the harvest is in and the cellar is full and the winter is still only a concept rather than a fact. Standing in that smell, in a cellar at 36 degrees Fahrenheit, while the world above was 41 below, Ruth Hendricks wept. She was not a woman given to weeping. She said so herself when she told me about it, with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of someone reporting an event that surprised them. She wept, she said, because the smell was the smell of preparation, of a summer that had not been wasted. And she had spent 3 weeks in a house that smelled only of cold and burning wood, and the particular anxiety of insufficient stores running lower by the day, and the contrast between those 2 smells was more than she could absorb without reaction. Sigrid handed her a carrot. It was firm, orange, faintly sweet. "Now you know," Sigrid said. "Now we will make soup." The supply train arrived on the 9th of March, 93 days after the last delivery. The locomotive came through the eastern pass trailing steam and the particular urgency of machinery that has been stationary too long, and it carried flour and coffee and salt pork and everything else that the valley had been without since November, and Holt Creek received it with a relief that several people described to me afterward as almost painful, the way a muscle that has been held rigid for a long time hurts when it is finally allowed to release. The reckoning began quietly, as such recalculations do. It did not happen in one place or in one conversation. It was distributed across many conversations over many weeks, accumulating like snow on a still morning, not dramatically, but steadily and with weight. Calvin Marsh came to Sigrid's claim on a Wednesday in late March alone, in the mud of the first real thaw, driving a wagon. In the bed of the wagon was the limestone. The flat gray slabs he had told her were spoken for 5 years ago. He unloaded them himself, stacking them neatly beside her cellar entrance without being asked, and he did not make a speech about it. He set the last stone in place and straightened up and looked at the entry tunnel of the earth cellar for a moment. The low sod mound, the heavy oak door, the thing he had called a Norwegian grave in the autumn of 1882, and watched his own family's food supply freeze solid while hers came through March intact. "I had no use for this stone," he said. "I should have sold it to you when you asked." Sigrid considered this for a moment. "You can stock it," she said, "in the store. Other families will need it now." He looked at her. "I will," he said. "At a fair price." "Yes," she said, "that would be correct." He drove back down the hill. That was the whole of it. No audience, no formal acknowledgement, no speech with structure and conclusion. A man who had been wrong about something important came to the place where he had been wrong and did what he could to begin correcting it. And the woman who had been right received this without triumph and redirected it immediately toward the practical question of what the valley needed next. Eleanor Pratt came the following week with a cloth-covered notebook and a good pencil, and she sat at Sigrid's table and asked questions for 4 hours and wrote down every answer. She did not offer an apology, and Sigrid did not require one. Eleanor was a woman who expressed acknowledgement through action rather than statement, and the action was the notebook, the willingness to sit in a small cabin on a hillside and be instructed by a woman she had publicly dismissed, and to write down what she was told with the careful attention of a student who has understood belatedly that the examination is more serious than she had previously believed. By the following autumn, 7 earth cellars had been commissioned in the valley. I built 4 of them myself and supervised the construction of the other 3, using Sigrid's design with minor adaptations for different soil conditions that she reviewed and approved before construction began. The Pratt cellar was the largest, 12 feet by 8, with a small separate dairy chamber, and Theodore Pratt watched its construction every day with the attention of a man who intended to understand what he was paying for. He was a better student than his previous certainty had suggested, which is often the way with capable people when the certainty is finally removed. The phrase "she built deep" entered the valley's common speech sometime in that first year of building. By the time I noticed it was being said, it had already lost its author. Nobody could have told you who first said it, because it had already passed through enough mouths to become the valley's own. It meant preparation below the surface. It meant knowing what the earth holds and building accordingly. It was applied to cellars and to people with equal ease, and when it was applied to a person, it meant something specific, that they had understood, before the difficulty arrived, that the difficulty was coming, and had done the work quietly, without recognition, in the long ordinary time before the proof was required. My grandson has been listening for a long time now. The cottonwoods are fully in leaf, which means the morning has run away from us while I have been talking, and the coffee in his cup went cold an hour ago, and he has not mentioned it. He asks me if Sigrid Halvorsen ever said anything in those later years about the 4 years of being called peculiar, about the Norwegian grave and the badger colony and the long patience of a woman who was right about something important and was required to wait while the people around her caught up. I think about this for a moment because it deserves a considered answer. She said something once, in the summer of 1889, when we were working together on the 4th cellar I built that year, and she was reviewing my plans with the same careful attention she had given her own flour sack drawings 7 years before. We had been talking about the clay layer, whether the valley's particular subsoil required a thicker application than her original design specified, and the conversation had moved, as conversations between people who have been through something together sometimes move, to the larger territory behind the technical question. I asked her if it had been difficult, those years before the winter proved her right, not the labor. I knew the labor had been difficult. The other thing, the isolation of being certain about something that everyone around you had decided was not worth being certain about. She set down the plans and looked out at the hillside for a moment. My father built his first earth cellar, she said, when he was 23 years old. His neighbors came to look at it and called it unnecessary. His father-in-law said the old way, a wooden box 2 feet down, had always been sufficient. My father said, sufficient for what the winter has been, or sufficient for what the winter might be. Nobody had a good answer to that. So he built what he built, and the first hard winter proved it, and after that his neighbors built their own. She picked up the plans again. He told me, "You do not build for the winters you have had. You build for the winter you have not had yet. The winter you have not had yet is the one that will tell you what your building is actually worth." She made a small notation on the plan, in Norwegian, in the margin. He was right, she said. He was usually right. And then she handed me the plans and we went back to work, in the good, clear air of a Montana summer morning, on a hillside that smelled of grass and warm earth and the quiet ongoing industry of a community that had learned, at considerable cost, the difference between the winter it had been having and the winter it had not had yet. The cellar still stands. I have been out to see it twice in the past 5 years, walking the hill more slowly than I used to, taking the grade at the pace of a man who has no argument left, with patience. The sod on the roof has been relaid twice since the original, and the outer door has been replaced once, but the stone walls inside are her walls, the same flat Montana sandstone we dry stacked in the cold of November 1882, still tight, still level, still doing the work she built them to do. Above the tunnel entrance, set into the lintel in a piece of sandstone, she carved herself in the spring of 1888, our words in Norwegian. Beside them, in letters less elegant but serviceable, are the words I carved at her request one autumn afternoon when I had a spare hour and a good chisel. The translation reads, "The earth does not forget cold, neither does it forget warmth. Go deep enough and you find the memory of summer waiting there, patient as stone, indifferent to whatever the sky has decided to do."